So this is under review, let's say. Graduate record examinations, or the GRE, are sometimes required and sometimes not. With the pandemic, these have not been required unless you had previous scores, but not everyone did. So for the most recent application cycle and probably the next application cycle, GREs will not be mandatory. The structure of the GRE is very similar to the SAT or the ACT. There's a math, a reading, and a writing comprehension section. They are timed tests, they're standardized tests. They are done on a computer and you have to study for it because you'll need a competitive score if a program does require it. So there's also the psychology subtest, which covers cognitive psychology, clinical psychology, biological psychology or components to psychology, research methods, developmental psychology, and social psychology. It's not always required, um, but again, it demonstrates a level of knowledge in a content area. So if you didn't take a whole bunch of psych classes, it may be wise to take the psychology subtest, but you're really going to want to weigh the costs and benefits of that because you do report the scores, whether you do well or not. Intensive studying, like I said, is required, and there are some classes, but those cost a lot of money. We're talking like upwards of $1,000. It's part of the testing system. Unfortunately, that makes it less accessible. There are a lot of accessible resources online that are free, but you really have to do the work to find what is a good resource and what will work for you. With the GRE or any standardized test, there are some cultural considerations. There are notable differences in scores when accounting for socioeconomic status, language, and other demographic variables. We see this at the SAT and ACT level where, affluent white people tend to do better. Um, and because of this, some programs don't require the GRE or consider the scores in context if they do require it, which means if you're a second language learner and maybe your writing comprehension or your reading was, a little lower, but you still had really high math scores and you've demonstrated that, you can get a degree and do at least undergraduate work um, in English, usually you're not faulted for that. Worst case scenario, if you do speak English as a second language, you'll be asked to take the TOEFL. There are some logistics to consider with the GRE if the program that you are intending to apply to doesn't require the GRE but strongly recommends it. Um, the programs that do require or suggest the GRE usually require between 50 and 70% proficiency across domains, meaning if you can get into the mid 70s, you have a really good shot of at least making it past the initial round of evaluations. The scores are good for 5 years. So if you score really well your first time, that's good for 5 cycles. If you don't score so good the first time, you can retake it and that'll be what is reported. But like I said earlier, all of your scores are reported. So if you take it more than once and you demonstrate an improvement, that tends to look good on applications. Um, and the downside is that both of those scores will be reported to the school. You can choose what school you want to report to if you know after you take the GRE, but before you receive your scores, or you can wait and sometimes it costs money to send those scores to schools. Also, keep in mind that GRE you have to pay for. So if you're going to take it more than once, that's something to consider is that, there is a cost involved. The GRE is only offered a few times a year. So it's offered in April, July, September, and December. If you are applying for programs that require the GRE, December is too late to take the GRE and have your scores reported in time. It takes several weeks. So the last time per cycle that you can take the GRE is September. And that gives you enough time to collect all of your application materials, also get your scores back and report them. Now, a GRE isn't make or break, but it is sort of used, unfortunately, as an indicator of graduate success. To what degree that is true is questionable. So keep that in mind. If a school is really putting a lot of weight in their GRE scores, it might be important to consider why that is.